Computer. They're going once, going twice, 3 times. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. Everyone, welcome to the Large Scale Scrum Meetup Community, global, local to New York City, but also global, fast growing and the largest worldwide. So we're here today, more of an informal discussion than a formal presentation, because I will be really the one will be paving the road and putting some concepts in place, and then we can open up for a conversation. And once again, if you can keep your cameras on, mics off, and be on a lookout for anyone who may not be recognizable in the forum here with not so great intentions of scratching on the, on the wall or on the virtual wall or doing something. Anyway, I think I have disabled most of the features, but in any case. So what has driven this, what has driven this event today were multiple observations over a number of months, and also involving different companies. Observations of some of the misunderstanding, genuine misunderstanding, and also there was also maybe a suspicion of implied overloading. Intended overloading of some of the terminology and concepts that have a very specific meaning in large scale Scrum. So I'll be using the slides that I usually use, and it doesn't really matter what the rest of the deck is. What's important is what I'll be sharing. I'll be focusing on some of those dysfunctions and omissions in defining the terms and definitions. So first, let me confirm. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Let me also open up. And everyone, Nicholas, Karen, would you please mute yourself just in case if you haven't done so yet. So let me start first. So I'm going to dive right into where I have seen some of the most prevalent omissions. And again, I could attribute them to genuine misunderstanding. And also I could attribute them in part to convenient, intended overloading, because some organizations, instead of actually trying to improve and change systemically, they just relabel and misuse terminology. They give very specific terminology their own internal new meaning, and by doing so, of course, they dilute the essence of it. So I'm going to look at less huge. This is where I see most of large organizations seriously slipping. They're really slipping and I think making mistakes. So one of the biggest challenges, right? And you can see my screen, true?
Yes.
Excellent. So they think literally, oh, we are huge, we're big, so we must skip everything else that was before or less huge. We need to skip Scrum. We need to skip less, essentially 2-day teams up to 50 developers. Let's jump right into less huge. Why? Well, because we're huge. It could be a huge insurance company, large insurance company, or a large pharmaceutical company, or a large investment bank, or a large credit card company. So we skip less and less Scrum and less, and we go right into less huge. That's what they say, that's what they think. Now, one thing to keep in mind is really the reason why we ended up with less huge, and the reason why we ended up with less was not because we were attempting to build bigger teams or make things bigger. Is because of necessary evil, if you will, because of the necessity to grow in size, and it would be driven typically by not by your organizational size initial, but by the product that is either already big inherently, historically, or has grown big. If you take a huge bank and immediately assume that just because we're big, we immediately need to think of huge scale and solutions, that's probably mistake number one. because that's really it won't really make you into a product-centric organization. It will most likely relabel, excuse me, existing organizational structures, and will just amplify existing complexity already. Just relabel it. So org size isn't the reason why you want to become huge. You probably, well, why you want to consider less huge. You probably want to think of what a product is and how it has grown over time, or why is it so big and why do you need so many people working on it? So with that, I'm going to pause for a second, just read these bullets. This is really for less adoption experiments, enthusiasts and people that actually want to experiment with less. These are probably some of the advisory notes. Just pause for a minute, you can read. So essentially what the takeaway from this should be, do not make things big, unnecessarily big, just because your organization is big. If you get to that huge or big or huge state, it should be either, well, as you probably remember from many other LeSS discussions, 2 to 8 teams up to 50 developers of LeSS adoption. It's a binary switch after long prep. It's you put your organization up all at once after you do a lot of prep work. But less huge, it's typically an organic, gradual, evolutionary growth. And it would be driven by your product expansion or taking on more large product business-centric requirement areas. So this is a visual illustration of LeSS huge, and this is something you can see on LeSS.works website, and I'm sure some of you have read the books, and it's already in there. It's also in the books. This stack of these 3 stacks, 1, 2, and 3, represent large requirement areas of a very large, widely defined product. And for each one of these large requirement areas, there will be an area product owner identified who would act as a fully fledged, fully blown, fully empowered product owner for that large requirement area. Not a proxy, not an attaché, not a admin worker, not a Jira tickets mover. No, a real PO. So this is just a reminder. This is what LeSS huge is meant to be. Large requirement areas, business-centric, business-aligned, side by side, effectively, complementing each other from a business perspective. Another graphic that I've put together recently is this. If you want to think of, evolution from Scrum to LeSS huge, it would be something like this. You 3 to 9 developers, 1 team. This is your typical. This is your usual Scrum. Large scale Scrum, about 50 developers, 50-ish, give or take, 2 to 8 teams. And last but not least, if you end up with LeSS huge, it could be hundreds of developers, and you obviously go beyond 8 teams. And then you would have an area product owner per each requirement area. Now, as I mentioned, standing up LeSS does not require an evolutionary growth. It's typically recommended to do it all at once by practicing and experiment. I'm sorry, by preparing yourself first before you flip that switch. The difference between Scrum and large scale Scrum essentially is the product size. If it's a very small product, 3 to 9 developers, 1 team can probably do it from bank to bullets, done. Well, sprint by sprint. If it's a much bigger product, then of course large scale Scrum would be an option. And this is where a gradual growth comes into place, LeSS huge. And it may take from months to years to get there. So, but again, the driving force here is not, change the fonts. The driving force here is not your organizational size. The driving force here is product size. That's why this arrow pointing up implies descale in organizational complexity. In fact, you need to descale your org structure, simplified in order to move in this direction.
Gene?
And yes, James.
Did you want people to ask clarifying questions in the middle?
I
There was some
will,
chat on that. I didn't.
Yeah, I will
didn't
pick
start.
this up. I see the chat. I'm out of the chat. I will take this at one back. This should be a pretty short conversation, so we'll open up for questions just in a few. Yep. Now, I really want to get to some of the dysfunctions. This is more of a replay. If we want to think about requirement areas and what defines those, then it's very clear. We need to understand those are defined by business needs, business requirement areas, not development. This is, so probably this is the place where I'm going to say a mission numero uno, problem number one. This is where organizations slip. They take existing org structures with existing sphere of control of influence, architecture, infrastructure, shared services, platforms, applications, you name it, and they just relabel them into requirement areas, essentially changing nothing about sphere of control, scope of influence, really not improving customer centricity, because you cannot be developing architecture in a silo away from user experience and user design and call this, oh, this is a user-centric architecture. It's just a mouthful, right? So that's that. And a few other observations about, I would say, borderline of intentional and unintentional slippages. Again, in large scale Scrum, unless huge, we recommend if we stand up, if we erect another requirement area, we want to oscillate somewhere between 4 to 8 teams, because if it falls shy of 4 teams, the natural question would be, why not just absorb this body of work into existing original requirement area instead of creating a new requirement area? Because every time we stand up another requirement area, we do create an artificial silo, which is not really desirable. So here's an example of a very classic organizational omission, because they don't understand, or perhaps understand and choose not to pay attention to it, that requirement areas should be business centric. They technically relabel everything that has a traditional control into an area. That's how we end up with component teams, 1, 2, 3 component teams here and there, representing fake requirement areas. So this is a classic example of when you got too many so-called requirement areas, or with 1, 2, maybe sometimes 3 teams assigned to them, most likely by relabeling existing structures into new structures. I'm almost done. And the funniest thing I've seen recently, different places, is where not only people don't, misuse existing and well-defined LeSS terminology, they paraphrase it and turn it into something that's probably very confusing to open source crowds or open forums. Probably means something internally, but until we start digging deeper. So here's an example. There is no such term in LeSS as an area product. There is a term product, square brackets, which you could drop, requirement area. A requirement area is a product-centric definition. So business, business aligned, but it's a product requirement area. Area product essentially is a very confusing term, and here is why. I was trying to think what's the best analogy to give to make people understand this is an omission, and I came with one. Think of this. This is a New York City subway map. Consider your entire city as a product. Then naturally, Manhattan Island or Brooklyn or Queens, depending where you're from, would be considered as a city requirement area. Probably makes sense too. Different socioeconomic, geopolitical requirements and definitions there. So it kind of makes sense. So a product is big. It's a city is your product. And each borough is your requirement area. if you flip this 180 degrees, then you would have to come up with something like tri-state area. That would be an area. Call it an area product if that's what your language requires you to do. Then the whole New York City would be an area city. So that's an 180% flip in the meaning. And with that flip, the meaning gets lost. So we essentially need to think of our product as you know, as a city, right? This is our product. That's what we deliver as less huge organization will be delivering. And each specific product-centric requirement area is what we could, you know, define based on individual business requirements. And this is where area product owners are aligned. So as promised, I'm looking at the clock at a watch, 20 minutes past the hour. We actually are done. So this is what I really wanted to expose and open up for discussion. And maybe it would be fair to look at the messages first, see? Or if people ask them there, just voice them. I don't, what's on people's minds anyway?
Hey, Gene, it's Mal.
Yeah, Mel.
Just trying it. I'm not completely tracking the New York City versus New York State, whatever, as an example.
Okay. I can explain.
However, I have a different example, which I think makes sense to me. I mean, it's Microsoft Office, right?
Oh,
It's a product.
Yep.
And then you've got Excel, you got Word, you got PowerPoint, all those things, right? So those seem to be, oh, look, and those seem to be, you know, essentially specific areas. Here's the question.
Yep.
In that superstructure or framework, where would the guys who make the squiggly line to tell you that it's a misspelled word or poor grammar, that squiggly line, let us just say that's like a deliverable. Where does that go in this kind of universe? Does that go all the way up to the overall Office product owners
Sure.
backlog, or is it in a, and then it's grabbed by somebody, or does it go into a specific one and then you just decide to share it?
Sure. I think the question is, like, for example, and let me paraphrase what I'm hearing and you tell me if this is right. A developer who is a part of Word, Microsoft Word requirement area is doing some changes to a code base that has to do with spell check, you know, another small feature for Word. So far, am I okay?
Well, it's not Word, because essentially that little squiggly line that says it's the word's misspelled, or the squiggly line that says your grammar sucks, that's shared across. I mean, that shows up in Word and PowerPoint and all sorts of other places.
That's the point I'm trying to get to. So you know, communication through code and shared technologies that run across these requirement areas would take care of what you just described. It is most likely that the feature he or she are developing for the blue box here, the Word, would invoke itself, would appear in the green, in the orange, and in the, you know, all other three boxes here, because technologies run across, and most likely these features are universal. Not surprisingly, because this is all, what's it, Visual Basic, whatever they use. So it's not unlike, that's why they're so compatible. You can copy paste, like, I don't know, you can take you can copy paste Excel macros into Word, and you can copy paste them into Microsoft Office. I'm sorry, into PowerPoint. So along those lines, so where they go, most likely, if this is initially built as a feature for the blue box for Word, you would sit in the area product backlog for, you know, for Word. But because developers communicate extensively and richly through technology, through code, this would become available to others. So there will be no artificial source code protection.
Right.
Yes, but you're also saying, and I think, Mal, we should try to clarify that. I mean, unless the real emphasis is to avoid redundancy and centralized groups that somehow manage code that's going to be shared. I mean, the whole point is to have the teams that build tools share their own vision, their own experience, their own brilliant new features like the squiggly line with the other members of that, the whole, if the whole
Sure.
org or the whole product family,
Uh,
so
uh,
that it's right to avoid redundancy.
Yeah, Paul, I think I mean, if you ask me, yes. So redundancy in code and by doing so, reduction of local optimization by a single function specialty or like a component
Mhm.
developer would be a big plus, because when we start looking at different legacy codes, different apps, different components, there's a ton of redundancy. This is all time and money and effort and energy, right? So centralized code repositories with, and all those great engineering practices would be.
I'm with it. I'm just trying to reduce this to English because remember, I'm one of the guys who doesn't do software engineering. I do live events.
I know exactly what you do. I know exactly.
So in my mind, essentially what we're saying, I mean, I understand the concept of a single repository or a single code repository and shared code and the people in different groups working on that shared code base. Is another way for me to just, in my primitive mind, think about this is that means the first person or the first group to notice the problem because they've noticed it first and stumbled upon it first or stumbled upon some nifty change. They're basically just going to de facto be the first people who get a shot at fixing it.
Makes sense. Yeah. And by the way, if we strip incentives and bonuses from doing what you just described, you will not see people actually inventing problems to fix just for the heck of it, right? Exactly, right? So whoever finds it first should be really, and of course, communicating through code and through just talking to each other would be super important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for question, for asking, Mel, and thanks for the comment, Paul. Keshav, you have something you wanted to ask?
Right. I'm sorry. I kind of got lost in the concluding answers to Mel's question. So, what is the answer? Do each of these teams have some part of this shared service, for example?
No. So maybe this picture would help a little bit. The initial graphic here. I wish it was PDF. So all of these three are a large product. And I'm going to spell this out like product and stop square brackets because it's implied it's a product. Product requirement areas run on the same code base. Shared services. Well, if you have something like this, you have to be very careful because we don't want to create a team that supports shared services. We want this to be the domain that any one of these areas can touch. But across from left or like from here to there, technologies run across. What separates these 1 and 2 and 3 are not technologies. If they do, then to a relatively small, very small extent. What separates these really are business requirements, like large, strategically defined business needs. Like this could be a trading platform. This huge product could be a trading platform, or Microsoft was a simple example we gave. And area 1 would be focused on on equities trading, and area 2 would be focused on spreads and credit swaps trading, or muni bonds, or trading on on margin. So it could be different variations of these. So what users and customers view as valuable product features. So think of these 3 large areas as very huge business requirements.
But notice that Gene did not say settlements component.
Right, settlements would be a component to any one of the aforementioned types of trading, right? So that would be a component. Yeah, that's a good point. Aaron, I see you raising your hand. Hi.
Yeah, hi. I think one of the challenges is that how external is the competition in these portfolio or product areas. Because
So competition, you mean competition by, just clarify, what kind of competition are you referring?
competition from other providers or competition from other investors in similar, let's say, product or solution areas that are in essence being driven to the business value. So if we're sticking with banking or financial services around banking, how much of a build versus buy environment the shop wants to be in its longer term sort of CapEx curve to be competitive, and so that's a real sort of fundamental driver, because it becomes typically fairly bureaucratic if you become a pure build shop. So the buy components tend to act as sort of competitive drivers to your build, whether it's by design or they're just by reality, because there are completed products that, whether they're ready to go live is a second story, but they're at least completed products, and versus sort of permanently incomplete products or lack of product management around whatever you're building. And I think that's a big driver in terms of portfolio. Does that make sense or no?
Well, maybe someone can try to answer. I actually lost you a little bit, Aaron. One thing, just to clarify, there was no concept of a portfolio in product development. So we don't manage projects, programs, or portfolios in Scrum LeSS. We built and we deliver product features. But your bigger comment. I lost.
But portfolios and suites are invested in by shareholders, because that's what ultimately often is brought to market, because that brings competitive, that adjusts the competitive landscape. Because
are you referring to when you say a portfolio, this is something to clarify, and it requires clarification. Are you referring to an investment portfolio?
No, I'm referring to a product management portfolio, like Cooper's product management.
That's why I wanted to be careful. So again, when we look at LeSS and LeSS Huge or Scrum, we move away from the concept of portfolio. That's why I was a little careful to understand what you were saying.
Sure.
If it's an investment portfolio, like I have an investment portfolio, and some of you may do too, it's a mix and match depending on your investment horizon and some other criteria. That's something else. This is a software development product, not an investment vehicle.
Sure.
Product.
No, I agree. But so as an example, like Azure has suites in Azure. Arguably, that is a portfolio across all the Azure product line in Microsoft, and that's a huge example. But you have smaller examples.
No, I'm not familiar.
Something like.
Someone wants to take it.
I think I have an answer. Sure.
Aaron. Go ahead. Yeah.
So, Aaron, I think the delta that you're missing is, so the LeSS teams would be focused on, solving the business problem. And if the best way to do that was to go and buy some third-party product to support some aspect of the infrastructure, then you would hope the team had the resources and authority to go do that. And if that's not the case, and assuming your product boundary you do wish to be that broad of a product boundary, and you probably do, then what incentives, I don't want to get into it, but what incentives are driving the teams to just not go out and buy the things that make sense to buy and to build the things that make sense to build and, weave them together? In other words, it doesn't have to be, the stuff we buy is separate from the product. The stuff we buy is just, we weave it in as we need to, and we go buy what we need to off the shelf, and we build what we have to, and the team is solving the business problem, not focused around any particular part of the tech stack.
Yeah, the only question I have in all of this, if you guys don't mind me asking, is, Aaron, what are you talking? I heard the comment there, the product is complete.
Yeah.
What's the definition of a complete product? Because products tend never really to be complete until they're
you'll be declared in let's say a upper quadrant in the competitive landscape by, let's say, the top 5-10 analysts, which tends to mean you at least have hundreds of customers, and they're buying. So the proof point is they're buying your suite at its relative degree of completeness and using it, which reconfirms your top qualifier status, right? So it's market, in essence, it's market validated at to some degree scale in whatever your specialized or niche market you're in, or if it's a broader market.
Okay, but how does that relate to whether or not we continue development on this, or this product is still moving along? I don't know where, we're looking at.
Well,
cutoffs.
because the more complete a product is and the more dominant it is in that leadership category, if it doesn't have substantial direct competitors, there's going to be a reduction in the CapEx behind that. And typically it's going to go into secondary or additional product lines. And you're going to go much more into a maintenance or expansion of the customer base. I mean, that's just how large scale
I
products
understand
are
that part
managed
of
and
it,
rolled
but
out.
that usually tends to innovate into something else that you're going to be building off of that product. So, all right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so, okay, well, that's a good thread. I mean, probably, maybe it's not fully answered, but at least we got some conversations going here. So again, the sort of one question spun off the other one, and hopefully at least the one that we did answer was that communication is primarily through code, predominantly through code. And if you build something in area A that just so happens needs to be also utilized in area B, then you don't need to recode it. You didn't need to redo it again. And that's the essence of going from component teams to cross-functional feature teams, and also improving engineering practice to the point that people read off of the same repository and commit to the same repository, etc. So let me pick another question from the chat. I see one is from Karen. When and how is the organizational design addressed? Is org design dysfunction part of that? So the big advice slide. So I think you're referring, Karen, you're still here, right? Big advice.
Still here.
Yeah. So treat org design as the factor of primary significance. So I guess what this bullet should really, we should interpret this is, do not trivialize, not to marginalize, not to water down the importance of org structure in team structure when we define our product. And it is our product that drives, less adoption expansion, right? So as an example, maybe, so this slide kind of relates to this slide. Imagine this, if we were to define each requirement area around technologies or existing power of control, areas of power and control, presumably not challenging org structure, then what will we be changing then? So in other words, if we are holding nearly and dearly to our hearts existing org structures, existing sphere of control and influence, I'm an architecture senior architect, this is my domain, I'm a component or application manager, these are mine applications, then we are creating constraints, we're putting shackles, right? We're putting handcuffs on our own ability, on ourselves, our ability to change this structure towards a different structure, whatever that is. Cross-functional teams would be, for example, the goal, right? It would be hindered. So that's why organizational design is the first order factor that defines organizational adaptiveness, systemic adaptiveness. If we have
So how do you go,
Yeah.
just can you give a little storytelling of how you go in and discuss with the powers that be that this is going to require different organizational design?
like I mean, how, how would I, present myself? How would I dress up for the meeting like this?
No, I don't
Excuse
see
me.
you as a fancy dresser.
Yeah, I'm not.
But how would you present it? How would you, I'm just curious. Again,
Sure. So I think I understand what you're saying. It's not, you know, I didn't mean to like make this into it is kind of funny, but I didn't mean to make it into a joke. So the how
love
part,
jokes.
yeah, I know you do. So Karen, so for whatever it's worth, some of these messages could be pretty powerful, and to some org structures and some control structures, they could be pretty I don't call it disturbing. They will be somewhere, maybe somewhere alarming, right? Because you would be challenging status quo, and you will be, maybe for some people you won't be challenging status quo, but you will be really giving them some radical ideas about how they would have to go about challenging someone else's status quo. Some of these discussions and some of these ideas, they're probably better off if you cater them implicitly. Maybe through you give this to them implicitly, maybe through system thinking and engaging them in conversation, like modeling the system so they can realize for themselves. At the end of the day, what I would recommend, at least that's just my advice, instead of selling something as a best idea, better or worse, I would use the verbiage of consistent or inconsistent with their own optimizing goals. So for example, if those senior people that I think you're alluding to are saying customer centricity, product focus, you know, short cycle time, short feedback loops, lean, blah, blah. Fine, great. So that sounds like you like it, right? Sounds that like it. See, try to make them understand that the current org structure isn't really conducive. It's not really supportive of the very goals that they are trying to achieve. How could this be a short cycle time discussion if you got, you know, 4 or 5 different silos skillfully managing external dependencies through layers of managerial control and other dysfunctions? By definition, it will be longer than if developers just restructure it into cross-functional feature teams and talk to one another. So I guess it's the question of, now that you know what you know, how do you really put it to use? Everyone here probably has their own views and tricks, depending where you
Thank
sit.
you, Gene. I mean, do you have the opportunity to see their metrics, their pre-Gene metrics, and then present, you know, metrics that you've achieved with, you know, similar situations?
I don't like using the word metric at all. I mean, metric sounds like a bunch of numbers. You know,
What do you like?
yeah. If you're asking what I do,
Results?
well, sometimes I fail, sometimes I succeed in catering the same message, but I don't lead with metrics, if that's what. So is
How
that
about
what
results?
results of what? Of what would
Well,
be?
I mean, again, you have to understand what their current results are, right?
Yeah.
In order to say these are, you know, the possible improved results, you know, with going with less, right? I mean, how do you sell it? That's what I want.
I would even, so first of all, no, anyone who understands less would never lead off by saying, let's do less because it's less. It would be very different, very implicit. It would be very common sense kind of thing. Like, for example, like that's why I keep mentioning system modeling would be the way to go, Karen.
Okay.
Or something similar. I don't need to speak to a senior exec and tell them you should do this because it's less because it's in the book. That would just kill that idea altogether. Just
I'm
another,
not saying that.
another method.
I didn't
Well,
infer
I
that.
think, yeah. But again, nothing beats, so first of all, you need to have your personal psychological safety to do so. If you have that, if you can go toe to toe with a senior executive and have a conversation, even if it's a short conversation, then you probably have a shot. If you have sit 5 layers down deep in the org, you can't really do this through metrics. No, it will completely fail. And large banks will be my proof. Anyone here on the call from a large bank will tell you that.
So you're saying you've worked with a large bank and you go in at a senior level to get the, you know, sponsorship.
I'm just saying that in order to make systemic organizational changes, you need to talk to executives that have control of the org structure.
Exactly.
And you don't do it through layers of mid-level management, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Got it.
And hey, Gene, this is John De Leon speaking.
Yeah, John, hi.
Hey.
Hi. Go ahead.
So, continue the same conversation, right? I understand what you're trying to explain, right? But I think what she is alluding to is that how do you sell it, right, to management whenever you present them or tell them, hey, your current org chart, right, needs to change, because you know that some people, right, even upper management might feel threatened, right, that their status quo or their authority, right, is going to be now challenged. They're not going to have same controls and stuff like that. So how then do you kind of make them support this decision and stay focused on it, regardless of how
I
they
understand,
might
John.
feel?
Yeah, so I unfortunately I can't give like a definitive, like this is a best solution kind of answer. Through maybe serious conversations, maybe through an executive workshop of some sort. Certainly wouldn't be like with a deck or with a best practices or a best solutions guide. That wouldn't be my approach. Of course, you need to be careful. Before you speak to anyone, you need to do some triage who you're speaking with to understand who your who your opponent is. But it's probably a combination of being able to hear it, to listen, to reflect. So now I think we're kind of going into like what would qualify a good change agent as a good change agent to make changes, to move along in the right direction. I think it's a gamut of things, but I would start with first, like even assessing, are we even talking to the right people?
Got it.
Yeah, because
So last
oftentimes,
comment, Nicholas said you can sell it when the success of the small team sells itself to the org. So would you combine going to the high level leader and getting commitment to work with a small team and get your success there and then expand it?
well, I think it's common sense. That's not less a large scale Scrum. It's not Scrum or large scale Scrum. Starting small and building up, as opposed to just doing big bang, 20,000 people under the sun, agile transformation. That would be the smart way to go, right? You have to prove, at least not in spirit, but in actions, that you are successful. That's why organizations that are doing piss poor with one team Scrum can really pull off a single, product development effort with one team effort. Should be rethinking whether or not they want to scale this thing. What happens when you scale this function? You end up with the dysfunction to the power of, right?
And Gene, as you know better than the rest of us, I mean, Craig.
Probably not, but yeah, but
Although Craig would want you to transform the organization, he also would agree that the best way to do that is to create a parallel organization built in the right model first and show that it kicks butt. and then prove to everybody else. Oh,
yeah, of course, yeah. So you're right. As a parallel organization would be probably a much better approach, just because it creates that, the ring fencing, you're creating protection, you're creating like a safe habitat so people can experiment safely. Of course, I always recommend not doing this. This is not a parallel organization. You're not just cloning the existing structure into the old structure. That would be silly. But you're right. Parallel organization concept is a very important, strong concept. By the way, I would also consider this as a cheap concept, because if you compare this to reduced risks and investments with respect to what large companies do when they do these big bangs, this is a no-brainer. Do the 50 developers, 38 teams. Make sure it works before you go guns blazing and install Jira and Jira Align to 30,000 poor souls, spending millions and millions of dollars of corporate budget. That would be actually very irresponsible to do the latter. If you are a business entrepreneur or a stockholder, if you knew that your company does it, you would be extremely unhappy. Aaron, I see you have a hand raised, so apologies. And then John too, yeah.
Yep, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, those are fantastic points. I think maybe to add on, leveraging the annual budgeting cycles, however much the people might not like them or be disgusted by them, they're there. And so figuring out how to grab some low-hanging fruit within the different let's say, unbundled parts of the budget for those smaller teams, and then being able to, make a pitch up to, a leader that is, or a few leaders that are actually sympathetic, which I think if you have that from the existing budgetary process, then I think that's a pathway to at least get the teams off the ground and start delivering value. And what's great is you have a compare and contrast, because you have existing in flight. And so you could say, hey, they delivered, 14 things in 2 years, and they have, 10 to 50 people, and we delivered, 40 things that have value, and we have all of our emails back from our customers internally or externally that say, this was great, I've been waiting for this, thanks for hitting the backlog, whatever. So I think that's the way that I've always sort of hacked the process over the years.
Yeah, so thank you, Aaron. So by the way, I apologize, I was like control finding through my deck just to
Impressive, actually, through 5,000 slides.
Well, I mean, that's just, these are just cartoons and graphics. But speaking of funding and budgeting, this whole conversation so heavily rests on finance and budgeting, right? So unless we start funding and budgeting products, our chances of actually defining them well and managing them well and building them well will be hindered. If we still continue budgeting through portfolios, to programs, to projects, to single function specialty, short-lived component teams, I mean, this is the meat and potato. This is the heart and soul. We're going to continue working, in the old legacy way by using new fancy agile terminology. So I'm kind of pointing to this book because one of Les books explicitly refers to finance and budgeting. And Bjarty Bogsnes is the gentleman who would always use as a resource for that, implementing beyond budgeting. He's got 2 books out, and this recently just spoke to our community a few weeks ago. So I recommend watching this and also
well, and to take it a step further, Gene, real quick, the modern new generation of development, which is extremely diffusive in its component architecture, you'll actually get less delivered now, no pun intended, or you'll have fewer high value things delivered now than you would have even 10 or 20 years ago, where you had much more consolidated componentry that had more functionality to it. So you could spend, in theory, even more and get even fewer things of value today by having so much diffusive, budgeting down to those component teams. And I think a lot of organizations are just starting to discover that.
True.
Because you're going in, because the modern tech stacks allow you such finite, intricate control, whereas 10 years ago, you've got much more, let's say, consolidated, components that were already sort of ready to build or ready to deploy, whatever limits they had. And so people are just sort of playing in the dirt to an infinite level, which just burns all your money.
Yeah, I agree. Well, at least it's consistent with my thinking. One extra graphic, very light one on the parallel org, and then well, we have to recap in a few minutes anyway. So think of this blue circle is your traditional legacy structure. So you build a small parallel org like so, and then organically grow it by shrinking the old one and by moving more people from old to new. By the way, this is a very powerful message to the rest of the blue by saying, listen, we're not trying to build a VIP clinic here and everyone else will be getting poor treatment elsewhere. You are going to be expanding the red circle here, and you'll be building this parallel organization based on the based on the blueprint that you think you want, you wish to introduce to it, and the blue will shrink. Not to confuse with this, the low layer here, the lower level, when you try to create a parallel organization, and then it's like damn it, doesn't have enough spinach, doesn't have enough momentum, and then you get it gets sucked back into the old structure, and it's like a macrophage from biology, if you remember. It eats the the little insect and is no longer. So that's not something you did not want to have. So that's really not a parallel organization. This is another example of it. Build it up, make it small, give it a chance, let it grow. So yeah, going back to just the last point, the whole conversation we started today was about the emissions and slippages in terminology and naming convention. I can't find the slide because of so many of them. I think we all understand. Hopefully, we all understand what those are. Let me know if you don't, and ask questions. We have a few extra minutes. What was the area product? That was the silly thing I was trying to. Yeah. So this is what we're trying to undo. Don't create microscopic so-called requirement areas. Don't define technology areas as business requirement areas and feel comfortable. That's not the goal. And of course, don't try to flip-flop words. That's almost like dyslexic, because with that, also fundamentally, you're going to change the meaning. That's just not just the terms, the meaning in the org structure that sits behind. Any other questions, thoughts? I'm happy to wrap this up 3 minutes before the hour so you can get back to your work routine or your next event. This should be recorded, hopefully. Once I close it, it's gonna go to the cloud, and that will make it available. And if you want to replay it or share it with your colleagues, by all means. And thank you all for joining. We lucky today. We had a peaceful and very civil event. No one barged into our Zoom. So let's keep it that way. And have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks, Gene.
Thank you, Gene.
My
Thanks,
pleasure.
Gene.
All the
Great
best.
job again.
Thank you all. That's all.
Happy
Joy.
Lunar New Year.
Indeed. Bye.
Bye.